So I really like a lot of long words. Intersectional environmentalism is a long one. But there's been terminology that essentially describes the same thing, whether we're talking about climate justice or, to put it succinctly, just making sure in our environmental advocacy we're also advocating for the protection of people. And just like animals, there are a lot of humans that are also endangered and facing a multitude of environmental hazards, whether we're talking about having poor air quality, poor water quality, etc. And when you examine the data to see who is impacted the most by these issues in the United States, unfortunately, it's a lot of communities of color and low-income communities that have more toxic waste sites and they don't have access to clean air and water and things like that. So in my work, after dabbling as a park ranger or at Patagonia and all of these different spaces, I wasn't seeing enough talk about the prioritization of climate justice. So I decided to start my own type of environmentalism and call it Intersectional Environmentalism. And I wrote a definition of what it meant to me, which is that IE, as I call it, is a type of environmentalism or an approach to environmentalism that prioritizes the protection of people and the planet. And not only that, it also sees the ways that the exploitation of our planet and how we treat our planet and society is often a direct reflection of how we also treat the most vulnerable communities in society. And the part that I love the most about intersectional environmentalism is also making sure that we uplift the diverse voices of people of color, queer folks, disabled folks, etc. when we talk about environmental history, because if we include their narratives, then we can have a true history of environmentalism and make sure that the people who are interested in caring about our planet see themselves reflected in environmental history, and with that representation, they'll take action. And I want to give a shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, who created intersectional theory. Sometimes words start to become very polarizing for reasons beyond their original intention. But Kimberly Crenshaw was is a legal scholar, and intersectional theory kind of started in the legal sense. So there was a case in 1980 something where GM fired all of the black women at a specific location. However, they didn't fire the black men and they didn't fire the white women. So when the black women tried to raise a case against the organization, they took it to a judge, and the judge said, well, technically this isn't a civil rights case because there are still black folks that are employed at this organization. And technically, this isn't a violation of any sort of gender issue because there's still white women working at this organization. And Kimberly Crenshaw's argument was not that we need to create a separate protected class that's for black women, but it's important for our court systems to also look at compounding factors that might lead to different outcomes for people. Because in this case, it was a combination of those two things, race and gender. So that's how intersectional theory started, just making sure you look at those different aspects of people's identities and how that relates to how they're treated in the legal world. But now, fast forward 20 plus years later, intersectionality is doing similar things, but is expanding beyond just the legal framework. Because all of us are dynamic human beings, and there's not one part of our identity that is our whole part of our identity. We should look at things like religion and race, how we were raised, all these other compounding factors impact the way that we experience the world around us and what we care for. So that's intersectional theory in a nutshell. So yeah, I'll get into a little bit about why I wrote this book and why there's a rainbow on it. But yeah, so this book in many ways is kind of a manifesto. Sounds like a scary word at times, but it's really an argument of why I think that we should care about the protection of people as much as we care about the protection of our planet, and that social justice doesn't have to exist way over here, and conservation doesn't need to exist way over here, and just imagining the possibilities if within our environmental advocacy, we're also advocating for people who are experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis. So this is the textbook with the rainbow that I always wanted when I was an environmental science student, that really dives into social justice, diversity, and inclusion within the environmental movement and space. And yeah, that's why I wrote this book, and I hope you all enjoy it if you check it out. But before we go into our signing, I was wondering if anyone had any specific questions about the book or about environmental justice or anything.
Are there any case studies in it? Any locales?
Yeah, so I'm all about the data as a bit of a science nerd. So I believe it's either chapter 3 or 4. I should know these things, but I don't. And that one specifically comes after a chapter about the environmental justice movement. So a lot of people know the civil rights movement. A lot of people know the Earth Day movement. So we're talking about the 60s, we're talking about the 70s. But a lot of people don't know about the environmental justice movement that happened in the 80s, that really combined the civil rights movement, the Earth Day movement, and they found out, even though we have the Environmental Protection Agency, unfortunately, there's still a lot of environmental injustices that are impacting the most vulnerable communities. So even though during the Earth Day movement, with the creation of the EPA, they finally created policy to divert toxic waste out of certain neighborhoods, what ended up happening is that waste was diverted to low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of people of color. So that's when they started to realize, without thinking about social justice, vulnerable communities are just going to have these problems diverted to them. So during the environmental justice movement, they needed to find the data because you can't really prove things without data. So a lot of this book refers to different case studies, whether we're talking about fashion, the presence of toxic waste, different health impacts because of poor air quality, water quality, etc. So I'd recommend going to that chapter that's all about the data.
How did you break your book down, and how did you organize it? And how long did it take you to write this book?
Yeah, sometimes when I think about it, I was wondering, like, what was I doing during this time? But it was a pandemic, so I wasn't doing anything. I was in a bit of a data research bubble, so just like in the dark corners of my house researching. But this book, I love design, and I think that art is also an incredible vehicle for change. And it's a way to make climate information accessible to the everyday person, because I've read so many textbooks that are science books that don't necessarily incorporate design and things like that, and people get a bit lost. And a lot of my work is also bringing climate information to social media and experimenting with different colors that might attract people's eyes a bit more, experimenting with making sure everything is accessible and ADA compliant. So that's honestly what went into a lot of the fonts and things like that. And the way I broke the book down, I wanted it to be, because the introduction is the only thing that's kind of in first person, and in many ways it is kind of like a textbook, but I wanted it to be a really fun textbook. So, yeah.
Yeah, related on that question, I was just kind of curious, what kind of compelled you to write this book? Has this been something that you've always wanted to do? Or during the pandemic, as you mentioned, you felt like, oh no, like I have to do something? Just curious, I'm like, oh yeah. How did you come to write this book?
So I always wanted to write a book. I've loved books like my entire life. But when I started talking about intersectional environmentalism, and suddenly I went viral online, there was hundreds of thousands of people messaging me, the world's largest environmental organization, saying how can we reshape our mission statement, etc. And it was very frightening, especially as a 25-year-old at the time, having WWF and NRDC and the Sierra Club and Patagonia just saying, rework our mission statements, and it was really scary. But I knew that I couldn't do it alone, and that there's so many people who've been doing this work for a really long time, and I wanted them to be a part of this book. and I wanted to meet the demand of all the people who wanted some sort of resource, and I wanted to do it as quickly as possible, as thoroughly as possible. But I mean, when else would we have a moment where all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of people want to learn about a topic like environmental justice? So I wanted to just get this book out as soon as possible. And I found a publisher who believed in me and a literary agent, so yeah, that's why I wrote the book.
I find it interesting that Kimberly Crenshaw got her start litigating for Chevrolet, because right now we're dealing with Tesla,
Yeah.
and black people, especially black women, are dealing with a lot of abuse in the workplace, so-called environmental issue, friendly company dealing with that. But
Yeah.
in regards to you, where, as a young person, where did you get your passion toward the environment?
I didn't really know that I could call it environmentalism until I started, studying it for my major. But I think it goes back to my grandparents. Like, my grandmother always had a garden that was pretty much organic, even if she didn't say, I'm doing regenerative organic agriculture. I mean, she was doing some pretty cool stuff, or even the ways that my grandmother took me thrift shopping. Like, I thrifted out of necessity, not because, I thought, oh, the waste,
Yeah.
And that's something that I always find to be a bit funny, is that a lot of people are living sustainably out of necessity, but they're not rewarded the same way by the environmental community. So some examples that make me kind of chuckle would be like tiny homes. People are living in trailers, they're the same thing. Are those also sustainable in some ways?
Yeah.
Or the concept of van life. Oh, so cool, you're driving around the country living in your van. It is really cool, I love van life.
Yeah.
But okay, by default, people who might be living in their cars for other reasons are also sustainable.
Yeah.
But people who are lower income are often shamed for doing those things, when I feel like we should also be empowering them as environmentalists and saying, hey, this thing that you're doing out of necessity is actually, finding some empowerment there, and then also providing resources so people don't have to do those things.
I like how you put it, it's a shame for some, but it's a status for others.
Yeah, it's really odd, and I think it's the way that society views wealth in some ways, because they're like, oh, good for you, you have so much money, you could be doing all of these terrible things, and then you're choosing to instead live in your van, or you're choosing to live in a tiny house. But I don't think that we should only praise the rich. We should also look at grandmothers like my grandma and say, oh, the way that you are mending your clothing or using your plastic bags, that's also sustainable at the same time.
Yes.
I was gonna ask, what was another piece of media, like a documentary or another book that has maybe come out in the past couple of years that really is kind of inspired you or kind of helped inform your work, even if it wasn't included in your book?
Yeah, so I think it might be over here. It's Braiding Sweetgrass.
Oh.
I know, I recommend it to everyone. I know everyone has Yeah, it's great. Please buy it from here. It's so beautiful, and I think it encompasses intersectional environmentalism in so many ways, because it's an incredible Indigenous woman who's talking about how she applies Indigenous knowledge to science. And I think it's a really good learning lesson for the environmental community to understand that we don't need to separate people's cultures from environmental solutions, because honestly, I think that we'll have better informed environmental solutions if we provide some cultural context. It's actually kind of laughable if we think about the fact that Indigenous people preserve 80% of the world's biodiversity at the moment, and are the reason why our rainforests are protected, and yet people are saying they're not going to people who are naturally protecting the earth for these climate solutions.
Is this focus mostly in the United States?
Yeah, so this book, it's mostly focused in the US. I do have some global examples, and then there's another version that's coming out sometime this year, we'll see. That also has voices from New Zealand and Australia and throughout Europe. But if I write another book, I think I definitely want to have some more voices outside the US.
I was curious because I work with remote island communities in the West Pacific, and you mentioned the word conservation, and this is a word that they don't like to be used because they see it as a wall keeping them out from their own resources. So I was wondering if you've ever encountered that in communities in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is, so one of the case studies I talk about are about island nations and climate refugees and things like that. So check out that chapter. But yeah, I think that's something that I do in my practice and within intersectional environmentalism is not letting the language get in the way of making connections with people. One example is I'm not religious, but I speak at churches sometimes. So people who want to be environmentalists because they view the earth as one of God's creations. And some people might say, I'm not talking to them, they're anti-science, etc. But I'm saying, look, this is another group that we can activate to care for this earth. Their reasoning might be different, their language might be different, but how can we bridge the gap? So I don't have to come into that space and say, today we're dismantling systems of oppression, intersectional environmentalism. I'll tweak my language to make sure that I can reach the most people that I can. Because if I didn't, I feel like that would be rooted so much in ego and not necessarily understanding and compassion.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's so true, honestly.
Yeah. Hi.
I don't know if I missed it, but why is there a rainbow? Just because you always wanted a textbook with a rainbow on it?
That's so funny. No, there's a lot of reasons. Okay, so in the summer of 2020, I made a protest graphic that said "Environmentalist" or "Black Lives Matter." I posted it, and that is basically why my career took off in the first place. That also had the definition of intersectional environmentalism on that post. So that post is the reason why intersectional environmentalism is legitimized, which is wild. But in that protest graphic, the text was in rainbow lettering, and I made that decision because, again, I love fonts, I love colors, I want to draw people in. So that's one reason to pay homage to that graphic. Another one is because I think rainbows encompass intersectionality really well, and just having overlapping identities and things like that. Another reason is I'm really passionate about climate optimism and solutions. And I could have taken a scarier approach to this. I could have had like a burning planet or like something like that. But I wanted people to feel really hopeful, and I want people to know, okay, even if I'm reading about topics that might be a little tough, that I can also root my environmental practice in embracing the solutions and things like that. So I want people to feel happy when they see this book. And then, shout out, I try to be an ally, shout out to the LGBTQ plus community. So I want people to feel represented. So those are some of the reasons.
Since you touched on the optimism, do you feel like the new generations are more inclined to be just like more conscious about the environment and changing just like the old ways for living and things like that? I mean, I don't want to say that because like I'm a millennial and I look at my parents or like the boomer generation and I do see a difference, but I don't know if it's just like me thinking that or if it's a real thing.
Yeah, I think there is a lot more optimism in the younger generation, and even just looking at climate media, like people are less responsive to like shout out to Al Gore, he's great. Well, his documentary I think is so important. 20 years ago already, wow. No, it's not 20 years, maybe like 10 or so.
I think it.
Oh, it's full 20 years. It's
About
more than
15 years.
20 years.
Wow, oh my goodness. But I think it was kind of a tale of the times. Like people needed that fear factor in order to act about the climate. But after 20 or so years of that, I think people feel really fatigued, especially with the pandemic and so many racial injustices happening. It's just too much for people. And I'm seeing the younger generation being really inspired by climate solutions and the thought stream that they will have a future, and not just saying there is no hope, there is no future, because that paralyzes people from acting in the first place. So I do see a lot more optimism in the younger generation, and I think they gravitate towards intersectional environmentalism because their lives are intersectional. It's all that they know. They're having conversations about race and gender and spirituality in ways that didn't happen before, so I think it just makes a bit more sense to them.
Speaking of optimism, how are you able to stay optimistic when you're dealing with this? And
Yeah.
is it difficult, or are you driven to
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes, but I think I try to just remember that. So there's this org called the NAP Ministries that I really like. They're coming out with a book. They just signed a book deal, so get the book in a couple years. But their whole framework is that rest is a radical act of resistance, which I love because I love to sleep. But more than that, like rest and joy are radical acts of resistance. So when you're out there fighting for the planet, I try to say that rest is a part of my activism, because when I rest, then I can show up feeling empowered and ready to do my work. So whenever I see people exhausting themselves in movements, I want to let them know, like, we can't do this alone. We do this in community. If you need to take time to rest and take care of yourself, don't worry. There's a whole global community of environmentalists that can tap in and tap out. So I try to put that into context. And then do things that have nothing to do with the environment, like watching The Real Housewives and stuff like that. Yeah. Well, I think if that's the last question, feel free to come chat, and I'd love to sign your books if you have one. But
Yeah. Thank you, Leah. The books are available over here at the counter, and if you already have yours, come on up and get them signed. Thank you, everyone.
thank you.